last time is we finished the authentication portion of the auth lectures, right? So today we're going to talk about authorization, and by today I mean like later today. Now, so cool. What we did was, if you remember, in our user, we kind of got upset. We refactored everything with hash secure password. So that whole 1 hour lecture is one line. And essentially, what we want to do now is we want to be able to create this login experience, right? Before we were able to create a brand new user. And with that, we hit this in the user's controller, the create, following the RESTful routing. And then we simply created the user with the params, right? And we did some sneaky work inside the params by utilizing the password attribute and then overriding the password digest attribute after bcrypt did its work. And then we just redirected to user. So you'll see some sort of user show page, right? So far, so good. Here, I have commented out this right here. And that is, if the user is successfully created, then what I want to happen is I want to be able to track that user now, right? I want to be able to create this session with a key of user ID and have that match the user I just made's ID. So far, so good? And because of this, anywhere else in my entire application, if I call session at a key of user ID, I should in fact be referencing this ID that I just made. Let's comment this back out for now, because this will come into play later. Just the idea that I can create the session as I create my user, right? Now, I've been trying to hammer CRUD and REST out of your heads, and now I'm thinking in my head, I need to be able to log in. So where would I want to create this login feature? Where would you want to create this login feature? Do you want to, in your user's controller, want to create a login? Would that make sense to you? Kind of, but ultimately not really. Right? Like I could see the connection, I'm dealing with something with the user, but it doesn't fit in exactly with what I want to do. So given that I just talked about creating this session, right, when the user logs in, when the user gets created, I need to be able to somehow track the session. That's the important thing. The session is what persists the state of my application, and the session is what allows me to track whether or not somebody is logged in. So I said session a lot. Right, I would probably have some sort of sessions controller. So Rails-G session will give me a sessions controller. Inside that controller, I'm going to do a couple things. All right. So the first thing is, I know I need this new. And what is this new in reference to? What am I creating this new session with? Right, the login. This is going to be the logic and the route to my login. Right? Before I take a quick peek into routes, what would you want your route to be? Like if this was your routes file, right? Routes, cool, and then you do resources blindly, and then you're like, great, user or something, right? What do you want this route to be? Right? Should this be resources sessions? No, right? That don't make no sense. So when the user logs in, let's think about that entire user experience, right? You have www.coolwebsite.com/login, right? That's like the route that you want to hit for your app. Does that make sense? Cool. That being said, right, continuing through this, if I wanted to show the login page, what would the route be? To? Wow, powerful class. Cool. And then where would that point to? The session controller I just made, right? And here I'm in it, specifically to what? New, right? Is that something you feel like you could not have logicked out yourself, or that that logic is not something that you think you can recreate on your own, especially if you're trying to implement a new feature. Right? Like, great, I'm talking about sessions, I'm doing sessions a lot. This thing has to do with sessions, let me make a sessions controller. Right? What I'm doing with the sessions controller is creating this login view for my user. So what do I want the route to look like? It looks like login. So I do a get to / login to my sessions new.
Without questioning the logic of that obviously correct solution, why would it be the root and then login as the path instead of like users login?
The login as the root as opposed to?
Like / login as our path instead of /users / login.
Oh, I see. The idea behind /login versus /user / login, right? None. If you wanted to do this, go for it, right? I just wanted to tell a story. Apparently not a very good one, but your app will be how you want to build it, which is why I'm trying to empower you to feel like, great, this is how I'm thinking about it. Let me get this app to work. And then eventually, as you enter production environments, you know how that logic flows. If you wanted to do /user / login as the route, great, go for it. And then you're gonna wind up writing all of this same logic, but in the user's controller, and that's fine. And it's fine because when you get to your company, very likely, unless you're a brand new startup, auth already exists, right? Like they have existed at some point, they've already created login. They're not hiring you to save them, like, listen, we just cannot figure out how to log in. Our app needs you so bad, right? But it's more about the fact that you have to understand how to do a new feature, and then you're probably gonna put it, right, in the new feature that you build, /user / login. And then your pair program with the senior developer, whoever's senior lead on your team, will ask you like, I've never seen it done that way before. That's interesting. Can you explain why you did this? And it might be a great idea. Just like, oh my God, we've been doing it this way for so long. That's actually better. And they might actually adopt your way because your logic is good. However, if the senior dev on the team, right, that you're working with goes, you know what, that's actually a pretty good idea. This is how we've started it. Can you follow our convention? At this point, you're just porting your logic over to their convention. And that is, let's say they didn't like /login, right? And they wanted enter app. Does that change the logic? No. So this is more about how do I implement a feature and just thinking outside of CRUD and just being able to hit routes doing some sort of action. Cool? Does that like answer your question? Is that good? Yeah, so you can do it if you want to, right? Now, when I do that, I'm going to implicitly render new. Here I'm explicitly saying it. It doesn't really matter. I can just change this to login if I wanted to, right? And then that would be looking for what file? Login.erb, right? Under what folder? Right, so smart. See what happens when you know Rails. So power. Cool. Views, oops, embarrassing. Views, all right, let me help you out. Views, sessions, new, right? That looks pretty familiar. Sign up, right? Just kidding, that's not the right one. Give me that. Login. Quick reset there, right? What is this flash notice doing? Right. I'm sort of thinking ahead here where I know that, hey, listen, the user's not always going to get their password correct, right? So I'm probably going to display some sort of like error message, right? If you leave this out, I mean, not a big deal, but you will want that user experience. You will figure it out later. So let's do that. Cool. Any questions on this form tag? Right? I just have a form going to my login path. Look what I built. Amazing. I get to login, going to sessions new as login. Therefore, login path will point where? Sessions new. Right, sessions new, right? Thank you, class. right? This is the login path right here as the helper. So my form tag will, by default, make what sort of request? Exactly, right? I do a get, right, to log in, gives me this form. Because of sessions new, gives me this form. Now, where does this form submit? Post to login, right? And naturally, you can name this whatever you want, but I'm going to be creating a new session with this data, and so I just called it create. You can call it anything you want. So far, so good? Awesome. So again, username and password. Here I put password field tag, so I wanted to show you what it looks like. Cool, right? Because I mean, I'm just, for the purpose of lecturing, I'm gonna show you what I type. You guys want to see it or no? Just leave it as password. Password, text field. All right, you guys want me to slip up and put my real password in? Smart. Cool. So let's see this login. Bloop, 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 bloop. I was looking up the status codes for Rails. That'll make more sense to you at the end of mod 3. Great. What is this? How do I get here? /login, right? We just talked about this. And there it is. Cool. So my username. Actually, this is embarrassing. I don't actually know my seed data in here. So let's just make a new user so we're all on the same page. Users new. Ready? Who do we want to make? Wow, that didn't really change very much. Who do you want to make? Mike Chang. And what's Mike Chang's password? Oh, Mike, they love you. Great. If I create this user, what should happen if you remember? It does a redirect to the show page, right? So I should see Mike Chang. Great. Here we go. Oh, embarrassing. What is this show page? Oh, I have a logout button. Great. It's all right. I was too far ahead. Show. Get rid of this. You saw nothing. Cool. And let's go to users 9. What the? Oh, that's what it was. Just kidding. Actually, I want some of this. Bloop. Bloop, bloop. Bloop, bloop, bloop. Does Mike do that at all when he deletes? No? Some of you will pick up this habit and blame me. Oh, sorry. Hey, Mike Chang. Wow, look at Mike Chang. Powerful. So here's the cool thing. Ready? In this migration, I told you to ignore. You could set default parameters for them, and this is just a picture of Guy Fieri. So whenever a user creates an account on my app, they just automatically, there's this oversized Guy Fieri picture. Cool? Great. And there's a delete button here. Cool? So great. Remember, I deleted the session, rather I commented out session in the create, so there's no actual session right now. So let's go back. Let's go back to actually logging in, right? So boop, 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 a great user experience. And now my username, I want to be able to log in as Mike Chang. Oh, frick. Did I capitalize something? Mike, just capital C or lowercase? Dang, I'm so proper. And cats, right? Great. What happens when I hit this login? We can always check the form itself and just go, great. Where does this form submit to? Get away, Chrome. It does a login, specifically a post, right? Because I told it to. In this new, it's going to post, this form tag is going to post to login path. Why did I use form tag and not form for? Some of you have asked when you would use one over the other. You're very close, right? So the reason I don't feel embarrassed or anything, the reason I force you to finish your sentence is because that's exactly what it'll feel like in the interview, right? It'll be like, hey, can you tell me more about Ruby and scope? You're like, well, scope is when it has access to stuff and in the length. It's like, okay, cool, right? So just get used to it. It is a bit uncomfortable, but as you say it, right, I'm just gonna guide you into it, right? And so you're exactly correct, and that is, we don't have an object here. So form for requires an object, right? When you're creating something, form for at user, form for at team, something that you need to create. Here we don't have an object that we're creating. There's no session table in our database. There's no session model. So naturally, without an object, I have to default to the form tag. Cool? Does that answer anyone's questions about form for, form tag? Also, there's also another one called form with, but we've given you the tools to learn. Great. So username and password, pretty simple, and it will hit the create action in session. So far, so good? Now, let's talk about this create action. Oops, sessions control. Let's talk about this create action. Remember, and I've left all these sexy comments in here, right? Remember, the first thing you get is not the ID, you get the username as indicated from the form. That's what the params come across as. So I'm going to actually look in the database to see, does that user exist? That's why I have to do a find by the username. I cannot run just find, because what does find give me? I'm default searching for an ID param. What if they have the same username, right? That's a very good question. That's when I would go into my models and validate uniqueness true, right? Yeah, which is why you can have the same username on certain apps, but then when you log in, it asks you for your email address. And by default, email addresses globally, universally, are always unique, right? Like if I'm still trying to make a new Hotmail, and I was like, wangtron@hotmail.com, like, sorry, can't have that one. You made that account back in high school, sorry, you lost the password. So, cool. Right? Just email addresses are unique by themselves. So typically, in order to not have to validate uniqueness in your database, some apps would just be like, hey, log in with your email address. Is that fair? Yeah? Great. So I see if they exist, right? And then I need to check to see, does this even exist? Because what does find by return me if I do not find it? Let's find out. Let's jump into the console. And I have a bunch of users, right? So user.first is ID 2. Cool? Username Michael, probably password Michael too. Right? So user dot what? What am I trying to do here? Right? Find by. Actually, let's do this. User dot last is ID 9, Mike Chang. Can I do user dot find by a, I don't know, let's just say ID of 10. Do we know, can we guarantee that 10 does not exist in the database? Yeah, because last should give me the last record. 9 being what came up, I know that there's nothing. It will return nil. Versus, when I run find, what does find return me if it doesn't exist in the database? That's right, error. This will break your code. Cool? So there's a difference between find and find by. Find by takes in optional parameters. Find will always default to an ID, and with find, it will throw an error and break your code, whereas find by will just return nil. So far, so good? Okay, cool. The next thing is I want to make sure that this right here even exists in the first place, because let's say I didn't have this, right? It's going to check user.authenticate. What happens when you run a method against nil? Yeah, but what error specifically? It's probably the most common error you've run into, right? Let's say I have 1, 2, 3 dot length, right? And then I will run to nil.length. Undefined method length for nil class. This is an extremely common error. Because what if I did an array equals to 1, 2, 3, and then I did array.length? What should it give me? What if I did r.length? Right? There's an undefined method happening. So far, so good? And so what happens is, in this find by, if I put in bad data, right, what would @user be if it does not find it in the database? Nil. So I need to protect and check to see, is this not nil before? Otherwise, if it ever comes back as nil, the first thing I'm going to run into is undefined method nil for nil class. That breaks my login. So this is how this is working. Ruby is very lazy, much like me. So let's learn some Ruby. Let me actually not put it all the way in the bottom because some of you are like straining to see the bottom of the screen. Let's do this. I'm going to clear the screen. What happens when I do true and true? What do I get? True, right? Absolutely. What if I do true and what's a variable I have not defined? X. Very good. Right? Have I defined X at some point? No. So what should I expect to see? You sure? It's going to try to evaluate what X is. And what's it telling me? Hey, you never defined X. What happens if I do true and false? What happens? False, because false evaluates to false, right? Lucky guess. Here's an interesting thing. What happens if I do false and true? False, right? So what happens if I do false and X? What happens? Who says undefined local variable X? Okay, it's false. Because Ruby is lazy, the and says both sides must be true. If I already know one side is false, do I even bother checking the second half? No, because the whole statement will be false no matter what. Ruby will save off that 0.0001 second and give that back to you. Thanks, Ruby. Yeah.
If X is first, X and then false, does it just...
100% X and then false will give me the error because it will try to evaluate what X is. So the idea is that if the first thing comes back as false, it will not bother checking the second half. And what does nil evaluate to in terms of its truthiness? False. So this is a lot sleeker. If user ever comes back as nil, it will never run the authenticate method against it. Does that make sense? Otherwise, what you run into is this really ugly nested thing where first you want to see if @user, right? Like .exists, something like that, right? Does this even exist? And then you will run into another if. So if this is true, then do @user.authenticate. Does this make sense to you? Except it can be combined in one line because of the way the Ruby language will evaluate. Are there any questions on why this works and it will not work the other way? Great. Cool. So let's just say, right, we're going to follow something called the happy path. Do you guys know what that is? The happy path is a common term in coding, and it just means this is guaranteed to work. Like, I'm going to give you an example, a scenario where all we're concerned about is, does it work the first time through? And then we will deal with edge cases later. So the happy path is going to be when I put in a username, that username actually exists in the database. Cool? It's a good way of testing and writing code first to see if it works, and then deal with the edge cases later. So let's just say I put in Mike Cheng, capital M, capital C, and that in fact comes back as somebody from the database, what will happen? This will evaluate, and it will be like, all right, cool, good to go. Remember what authenticate does. It takes in the plain text password, and then it will return the user object if true. Otherwise, return false. So this should return true. So far, so good, right? Then I create the session. Session at a key of user ID is equal to that user's ID. Then I will finally redirect to user. Yeah? Otherwise, if this does not work, I will create invalid username or password, redirect to the login path. Why am I putting username or password as opposed to telling them specifically, hey, you put the password in wrong? Yeah, you don't want to tell somebody like, hey, that username is great, password's a little off, maybe change one character. This isn't mastermind, right? You just want to tell them, hey, both or one are wrong, who knows, try again. Because you don't want to hint to hackers potentially and let them know, hey, you're pretty close, right? That would be terrible. So you just redirect them to login. If they don't successfully log in, you can be like, hey, try again. And because this is a redirect, I need the flash. Great. Any questions so far on just this create method? Do I need to what? Oh, yeah. So back in the login, right? I can just bring that back. Cool. Any questions so far? Awesome. So we have the create. Session will exist globally within our application at a key of user ID. When I redirect to user, I need you to think this through. Do I know who is logged in right now at that user's show page? I go back to user, and I go here. Do I know who is logged in? You do? Yeah, absolutely. You have sessions as a developer, right? Does the user know who's logged in? Cool. Let me show you something. Hopefully this will work. Cool. So let's log in. Oh man, embarrassing. Exot. Cool. Let's do this. Ooh. Great. What is it? Mike Chang? Oh, whoops. Don't tell him I did that. Cats, right? If I log in, I should see. Oh, embarrassing. Cool. Great. Come on, server. Feel this pain for a second, because this will make more sense to you and it will be useful to you in mod 3. When you refresh or you hit a route, notice how it's not always 100% consistent and it takes a random amount of time. Sometimes it loads instantly, sometimes it takes 3 or 4 seconds, right? Keep that in mind because I will use it in mod 3 for you, yeah? So great, I have user show page, it's Mike Chang, that's the user that I just logged in as, right? And I even see this delete button. What if the user was like, oh man, I see you're following RESTful convention. Let me just go real quick to user 3. Wow, it's Michael. And I can still delete that account. That's probably not a great user experience. I can even go to 5. Also Michael. Sorry, 7? Bangarang, Rufio. Great. So I'm looking at different users' accounts. Their entire detail, even the delete. Do you like Bangarang? Not really. Hook was a great movie though. Are you sure? Lols? Okay, great. I deleted your account, yeet, right? Cool. User, what, 7? Doesn't exist. Because find throws an error, right? You see how this throws an error? If I did find by, what would happen? I would get nil, and then I can do something with nil, right? If user is nil, redirect to index, something like that. So that's kind of like how you can utilize find by differently. So 7 is gone. I'm logged in, right? The user session right now is what? Is Mike Chang. But I just deleted Rufio over here. Is that the user experience you want to create? No. So before we move on to that and protecting routes and doing all that stuff and tracking the current user, is there any questions on creating the session and login in and of itself? Powerful class. Great. So the idea here is that I want to know who is the current user right now so that if I go to a different route, that person doesn't have access. I need to be able to check against, hey, if I go to users 8, right, I should be able to run some sort of method that says, hey, current user is 9, but I'm on user 8 show page. I need some sort of like comparing session user ID, which is 9, to the params ID. Does that make sense? Because the params ID is coming in at what right now? Right. And then that way I know and can identify whether or not that person is the current user, and if that is the matching show page, then I can do some logic. Thinking through this, in terms of the current user, what part of your application needs to know about the current user? Is it just the user page, the user controller, the hamburger controller? Or like what part of your app would you want to track who's currently logged in right now? Do you want it in a specific controller, and which one and why? Sessions? If I put it in the sessions controller, that means that all of my logic about who's currently logged in would only be available to any view pages in session. Right. I want to know who the current user is throughout my entire application, whether or not I'm doing a login or whether or not I'm trying to add nachos to my cart, right? The nachos controller, whatever it may be. What controller do you know? Great. Cool. So let's do that. In my application controller, I have a few things here, and I'm going to explain. Ignore this for now. I have a method called CurrentUser, right? Because I keep saying that. You probably are thinking the same thing. I need to track who my current user is. Remember how I said the session is available globally. I can just call session anywhere I want. Therefore, the current user is the user.findBy with the session. Right? Here's the issue with that. The issue is, what happens when this is nil? What do I get for current user? I get a nil value. So is it useful to know, hey, this person is logged in or nil? Is that useful to you? Yes, right? I'm going to create another method called logged in. And it's just something called Bangbang current user. And let me explain. So, boop, boop, boop. Let's just check the console. Cool? So, what do we know about this bang operator? It will return the opposite in the Boolean coercion. So, if I were to say true and then not true, what would I get? Great. If I were to say, what is not true? True, right? So what is 7? True or false? What if I said not 7? What if I said not 7? I can take any value and coerce the Boolean version. You guys laughing because I'm saying Boolean? Funny? I don't know. Because I always focus on like B-O-O. Always like Boolean. I don't know. It's a weird word. So I can take any value and tell you whether or not it's true or false, right? Even false, not false, not false will give me the correct Boolean value. In the same way that I can say, what is nil? Nil is nil. Very good. What is not nil? True, because nil will evaluate to false. So what is not nil? So I can take any value and make it a Boolean by using the Bangbang. There goes the train. Yeah? Any questions? This usually confuses people for some reason. Keep going. Awesome. So we'll do that. So current user, what is this telling me? I'm making it a Boolean, right? So if this happy path returned a user object, because that's what user.findBy will do, and then I'm just going to say it, and then I bang this current user, right? What will this return me? True, right? And if this returns nil, and I do this operation on this variable, what will that return me? False. So if something ever returns a Boolean value as a method, the good best practice is always to add a question mark, because when you call the method, it will tell you, hey, automatically, because I see a question mark here, the return value of this method should be, in fact, a Boolean. Cool? Yeah.
Is Bangbang the same as doing if current user return true?
Yeah. And no, right? If you were to do that instead, what you're saying is if current user, right? Then you'd have to do this the hard way. Return true, else return false. So this whole thing is this. So, I mean, you can write it either way, but again, I'm just trying to level up your code so that you can take it to the next level. Cool? Because you now understand how Ruby is evaluating and how Ruby is written, you can take advantage of not writing, I don't want to say trash code, but like unnecessary amounts of code. This would be a clean optimization. Are there any questions? Actually, I'll just leave it in there for you. Yeah? Because if you left it at just if current user, right, it will return nil unless you specify it to specifically say return false, right? And so that's kind of like the difference. Awesome, great. So now, actually, sorry. So I was gonna leave it in. When I see trash code, I just want to get it. No, great. Now, I know who the current user is and whether or not someone is logged in at all. And that's useful for me. And then finally, I have a method called authorized. In the same way that I'd authenticate in part 1, part 2, I'm really just checking to see whoever's logged in, do they have access to whatever it is that they're trying to access? And so authorize just says, hey, if I call this method, you will automatically redirect to login path unless someone's logged in. What this is saying is, I will automatically redirect you to login unless you're logged in. So that should make sense to you, right? Like, hey, let me go see user 7. The first thing I want to check is, wait, are you even logged in? Should you be authorized to see user 7? If not, go back to login. Wait, are you logged in though? You are? Great, go ahead and see user 7. That's kind of the logic and the thought process, yeah.
So you have the before action authorized. How does that
Cool, I said to ignore that, but I'll answer it.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm confused about how that doesn't turn you into an infinite loop, given that you're calling it before itself and before the methods it depends on.
100%. Cool. So, I like where your head's at, and you're very smart. Does anyone see a problem with checking to see if you're logged in before you can log in? And if you're not logged in, try to log in. Right, the problem is exactly what you're pointing out. And that is, hey, I want to log into your app. And then the app immediately says, great, you want to log in? The problem is you're not logged in, so go ahead and log in. I'm sorry, what? Yeah, but you're not logged in, dog. Go ahead and please log in. In order to try to log in, it'll block you and say, hey, but you're not logged in. That is very frustrating, and that is a very annoying bouncer that should get fired. So what does this do here, right? What does before action authorize do? Right. If I do not specify something like, hey, call this, I don't know, only on certain methods, it will call it on every single method. So far, so good? This is what controller and what inherits from application controller. So by putting this line here, I've essentially locked down the entire application. Any controller that inherits from application will get this method called on it. Right? Just to be more explicit, I'm going to ignore this for a second. Cool? So this blocks it. Let's see this in action. Great. I want to go to users 8. Okay, just kidding. Oh, actually, no, that's exactly right. So I don't have the server up. Embarrassing. Cool. This works, right? Why? Because I'm logged in, right? There is a session that exists. How can I get rid of the session? Well, I haven't built the logout button yet, so I'm gonna have to hack it. It's kind of jank. I'm going to my cookies, and if you remember from like literally yesterday, the session is inside the cookie, and I can just blast them. Therefore, does my session at a key of user ID exist? No, it doesn't. What happened when I refreshed? It automatically bumped me to login, which is exactly what it's supposed to do. And then it says, localhost redirected you too many times. Let's take a look at the logs. Great. Somewhere here, it did a get to login. And then it ran the before action authorized. And then it said, hey, redirect to login, because you're not logged in. 302. Great, get to login. It will run the before action and then tell you what? You got to go to login to log in. Cool? And then it will keep doing it. And then Rails is smart enough to realize after the umpteenth time, it will say, hey, there's something wrong here. You're just hitting this one request too many times and you busted. Cool? So wouldn't it be nice to somehow skip this before action? Right? That's what we want to do, right? We want to skip the before action. But where do we want to skip it? On the login, right? And where do we create the login? Under users? Under session, right? So session, wouldn't it be nice if there was some sort of method called skip before action? Powerful. It's almost like this code is readable. And we want to skip the authorized action only when we are trying to log in and create the session. Does that make sense? So I can also skip before action authorize any pages that I want to be made entirely public. So for example, let's say I'm on Twitter, right? Tweet, 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 cool. Can you, without logging in, see certain public Twitter accounts? Cool, that's skipping before action on those. And then there are certain private accounts, right, that you can't see at all unless you're logged in. And then you have to be like friends with them or something. I don't know, am I talking about Facebook? I don't know. I'm not on social media. But you get the idea, right? That you can, in fact, open certain parts of your app to a completely public domain, and then other parts call this authorized action. Does that answer your question? How to get out of the loop? Cool. So let's test. Great. Let me go to, I don't know, users 9. Great. It bumps me to login. Login now works. Cool. Yeah.
You still haven't fixed it. I think you still haven't fixed the call, but like you can just go into the environment to user/site.
So let's log in. Ready? Michael Chang. What is it, cats? Powerful. Great. Now I'm on 9. The issue that I have now is I can delete this account. And when I go to 8, all it's checking is that before action authorize is simply checking, is somebody logged in? So will this prevent me from looking at it? No, it doesn't. It doesn't have any check to see, hey, the person that's actually logged in, does that match the route? That's like this next part. Any ideas? Yeah. Header reject? In a lab? Header reject?
Probably not, but
Interesting.
so I remember.
That's okay. You're very bright. No, it's just a good thing. Sorry, just observing. All right, so this is what we can do. Cool. What we want is, this is a method defined on my controller. If I would like to use any method built in my controller directly inside my view, I have to call this helper method. Otherwise, CurrentUser, as defined as a method on my controller, is not allowed to be used in my view files. So far, so good. Therefore, in my user's controller, do I need to really kind of do anything? I'm going to comment this back in. Do I need to do anything in my user's controller? No, I can just go straight to my view page. Right? So I can either wrap this whole thing in an if statement. If, right? Which user is this right now? It's always @user. Because look at how we're interpolating it. It's calling @user. It will be whatever user this page is. So if @user, I don't know, .id is equal to the current user.id, how come this is not highlighting? So look like a Ruby, right? Cool. Then I can, if this is true, then display this. Otherwise, I can do something like else, right? A quick, I don't know, h1. Just be like, not you. Winky face. Cool. Let's take a look. But I am user 9. This is known as conditionally rendering. Are there any questions? Great. This might be a little bit too hardcore in regards to, blocking out entirely. You probably just want to lock out the delete button. Right? Like, I still want to be able to see all my friends, but I shouldn't be able to delete their account. That'd be crazy, right? And so this is how I can use this helper method that was defined inside my application, directly inside my views, and lock down parts of my application, even parts of view pages. So I see Mike Chang, I see this delete this account, I refresh, it's still there. Boop, boop, boop. Now I showed on user 8, see Alan Turing, but the delete button is, whoa, you saw it? Fade out. This delete button is gone now. Cool? Just to prove on the bottom of the page. Are there any questions on conditional rendering? How that works? Let's think this through one more step, and that is, let's say I had a navbar at the top, and I logged in. Should I still see sign in when I log in? No, what should I see? Log out, maybe like your user profile name, like, hey, welcome your boy, and then like a picture of me or whatever, or you, I don't know, all right? Where just like application controller, right? Everything inherits from application controller. Where can I put logic that every single view holds? So here in the body, I can have some sort of, I'm not going to write this code, right? I can have some sort of, this is not going to work. I have some sort of navbar, and then add conditional rendering here. And this is how, like in the navbar, throughout your entire application, if you're logged in, then you should be able to switch it. Whether to sign in, if you're already signed in, it should change into a picture of whoever it is. So something like, if logged in, then CurrentUser dot, I don't know, avatar and like a little picture, else sign in button. All right, you see how this is working? Cool, great. Last thing is, you shouldn't have to hack your way through logging out. You shouldn't expect your users to open up the Chrome DevTools, go to application and delete the cookie. That would be crazy. We'd also have to remove the session. And you can either run session.delete at a key of user ID or change it to session at a key of user ID to nil. That will effectively delete the user session inside the session. Does that make sense? And so how do they hit this route? Yeah, what's up?
So if you ever had a card or anything, would it delete the card as well?
No, it's only deleting the key of user ID.
Oh, right.
Right. I can log out and the cart will still be there because that was a session at a key of cart. Right? Very good question. Very good distinction. Specifically, now, either one will work, right? You logged out, be good. And then what would happen? Flash notice you logged out. So redirect to login path, right, will bring me right here. Flash notice says you logged out and then display the login page again. Cool? See how that's working full circle? How do I actually hit this destroy button? This destroy action. I could just make a logout button, maybe even a link to. But where does that go? Wherever you want it to go. Sends a delete request to log out. As long as I hit session destroy, this could be effectively anything. So I think in the show I had this earlier. Yeah, something like that. Any questions on this? How you would do this? Great, now you guys are all auth experts. That's all I have for you today. Thanks so much.